Hey everybody, it's Susan again. I promised that I would just talk through these last few slides where we take a problem of practice and we use the guidelines to think through it. And we're just going to use one of the principles of the guidelines just to give you a taste of how this might sound in the mind of a designer. Um, the problem of practice is related to reading. The learners are not reading on their own. The teacher says, my reading groups are effective. I provide targeted instruction to small groups and students are typically engaged. I'm not sure, however, how to better support students to engage in reading on their own. This has been a concern during distance learning, but even back at school, it's something I'd like to improve. So the issue is that students are just not reading independently, and the teacher is kind of considering this sort of this like a problem of practice, like something I want to dig into and understand better. If the teacher knew, like, oh, it's because blank, then he or she could just take that barrier down and remove it. But she's going to think a little bit through the problem of practice with the guidelines. So when we, and this is not a formula, but I just think sometimes when we learn about UDL, it's like they sit over here on the slide deck and they're not like here in the mind of the designer. So I want to just put them in the mind of the designer, but I'm just one designer. So there are lots of ways to use this framework. So I've circled on this image of the guidelines, which you're going to see multiple times in this next set of slides, the principles of the guidelines. So the first thing I might think about as I try to address that problem of practice is, have I provided learners with multiple ways of becoming engaged in this independent reading activity? I might also think about representation and the recognition networks of the brain. Have I provided learners with multiple representations of the content, or am I just giving learners only one, text to read, or one representation of the text to read? And finally, that third principle, multiple means of action and expression. Am I thinking about learners having more than one way to act and express their thinking, their understanding, to be employing their executive functions, to physically act during independent reading time? And now I'm just going to focus I'm not going to do them all, just focus on the engagement principle for the example. I'm not focusing only on the engagement principle because that's the only one that matters here. They all matter, but I just wanted to show you how I might think through it. So I think, well, I'm going to spend a little time thinking about engagement. Okay, because they're not really engaged, so that's a good place for me to start. So what should I pay attention to other than just how do I get them engaged? First guideline says, provide options for recruiting interest. I think I have so now we're looking at an image of the UDL guidelines with the recruiting interest guidelines circled. And as I said on the CAST webpage, UDL guidelines, cast.org, I think it is, it's linked now. Janet wrote it in the chat. I think she'll put it in your materials. You can click on every single word on this document and find research and strategies behind it. So provide options for recruiting interest has little fine print underneath it, and we call that fine print the checkpoints of the UDL guidelines. So the guideline says, if you're designing multiple means of engagement, one strategy, one thing to pay attention to, one component of design is providing learners with options for becoming interested. How do I do that? Then you might want to dig in a little bit to that fine print, which is called the checkpoints, and I'm going to read in the squint, I'm a little old here. Optimize individual choice and autonomy, optimize relevance, value, and authenticity, minimize threats and distractions. That first guideline, that options for recruiting interest, I like to think about in my mind as like a design question, right? So then I say to myself, okay, I want learners to be able to read independently and to engage in that. How will the design of this independent reading provide learners with options for becoming interested? So now I have a question to answer, and I think about that. The image on the right is a picture of two students who are kind of working diligently at a table, it looks like with some art materials. And then I might think about, okay, I thought about that. Now I'm going to think a little bit about the second guideline here, which is provide options for sustaining effort and persistence. Again, if I'm like, oh, I know it's probably because they do start reading, but they give up and they don't keep going. So I'll do this. Maybe I think, I don't know what I would do about that. So those checkpoints are kind of a more fine-grained kind of like food for thought for me to think about paying attention to. And again, not just food for thought, but evidence-based practices that align to those principles, which are aligned to those networks of the brain. And the design question here is, how will the design provide learners with options to sustain effort and persistence? Am I building that into my independent reading lesson? All of a sudden, I'm going from like, wait, I'm teaching reading to I'm designing for engagement. And I love that about UDL, that it's not just be an engaging teacher, but design for engagement. And then finally, self-regulation. We know that if we're thinking about providing multiple ways for learners to engage, we've got to pay attention to that that self-regulation capacity and opportunity for learners in that learning design. So this guideline says provide options for that in the lesson, not as like crisis management, but like proactively. If you decide that you need to, grab a scrunchy ball or take a break or, talk to a friend, then, there are options for you for self-regulation during this lesson. And here's that design question. How will the design provide learners with options to self-regulate? And you see a picture of a young man sitting at a table with a schedule on the wall behind him. It looks like he's working on something. And then I would think about the same thing. So I've got this problem of practice. Learners are not reading independently. Is there some clue for me in the representation guidelines? Something about the way the content's represented. So let me talk myself through these questions, Have I provided options for perception? And with the work that you're doing on technology, I think that's one to put a gold star next to. Options for perception. The teachers that I work with, and I work with a lot of teachers, I think that's often the job of special educators, right? But how do we really build that into the job of learning designers, no matter what the role in the district? Options for making meaning of language and symbols. Options for comprehension. And finally, the principle of action and expression. We pay attention to options for physical action. Is there more than one way to physically navigate the learning, or does it have to be done, with your finger on the screen? Are there options for expression and communication, learners showing what they're thinking and knowing and understanding, and options for employing executive functions, options for learners to manage and organize their own learning? So I would be thinking about all of those things, and they would all become design questions to me, almost like each guideline says, "Hey Susan, think about this in your problem of practice," or think about this in your unit on mammals, or think about this in your algebra course at the high school, or think about this in the English language arts department at the middle school. So it doesn't have to be a problem of practice. It could be any designing thing that we're doing. We could be thinking about these are the components that we can pay attention to if we want the work that we're doing in learning design to be aligned to what we know about the brain. I also like to just remind myself and everybody that it's not just engage. I could do all of those things, and it's not enough if I don't see myself in the learning, right? So some of the work of culturally responsive teaching reminds us that it matters what's in that text. You can make it as accessible as you want to make it. You can have 1,000 pieces of technology connected to it, but if it's still a text that is one more text in this course or in this school experience that has no reflection of my life, I don't see myself anywhere in this curriculum, I'm probably not going to be engaged no matter how much you design for engagement. This is a quote from Dr. Goldie Mohammed from her book Cultivating Genius, an Equity Framework for Culturally and Historically Responsive Literacy. She says, before getting to literacy skill development such as decoding, fluency, comprehension, writing, or any other content learning standards, students must authentically see themselves in the learning. So I think that's an important reminder too, that the content matters. I'm always happy to hear from you. Here's my email if you need it. This is just some the CAST content information. This is that expert learner characteristic slide that just has the text in a more accessible way, I hope. And this is a Universal Design for Learning kind of process that I didn't think we would want to get into today, but I will say something about it now since those of you who are here are still listening to me ramble on. It's just that we set goals first. That's a really important part of UDL. And sometimes the goal in UDL can be mistaken as like what's the goal? Oh, they're finishing chapter 7 and they're doing the last 5 questions at the end of the unit plan. It's not really a goal for learning. That's a task. That's a to-do list. So the goals should be something that learners are understanding, that they're going to know, like facts and information, or they're going to be able to do. And the goals should be clear. And then this is for you, Brent. The goals should be separate from the means. So the goal should not be learners will understand ecosystem by demonstrating, and then demonstrate it by building an ecosystem of their own in a shoebox using materials in the art class, right? That's really forcing learners to show what they know in the same exact way. When we have a clear goal, learners will understand that an ecosystem is a habitat that blah, 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 blah. We can think of a lot of ways for learners to demonstrate that understanding. With understanding goals, with those content type goals, we can think of a million ways that learners could show and demonstrate, and learners could probably think of 1,000,002 more ways, right, that they could show what they know. Sometimes when it's a skill goal, people ask like, well, what if it's write a 5-paragraph essay? What's going to happen then? And I think that we just have to shift where the flexibility lives, right? So the flexibility lives in the ecosystem example with how you show that. Writing a 5-paragraph essay, I should say composing a 5-paragraph essay, because not everyone's going to write it. Composing a 5-paragraph essay might be the goal. And if that's the goal, then how can we build flexibility around it? So can I build scaffolds and on-ramps to that goal? Can you write with me by yourself about something you love? Can you write it? Can you speak it first? Can I scribe it for you? Can you do it on the moon? Like what can I do to help you to meet this goal by building lots and lots of choice and options for how you get there? So the clear goals are really important, goals separate from the means. Then anticipating variability, right? Not designing one-size-fits-all instruction and then saying like, oh my gosh, I've got to remediate, I've got to enrich. Sort of those are really old phrases and terms thinking about instruction. Knowing ahead of time, I've got learners who vary with all of those dimensions of variability, and so I'm going to anticipate that and design for it. I'm going to right out of the gate, just like that building. They knew that people would vary who were going to use that space, and they designed this wide ramp with handholds and colors and all sorts of supports for people to be able to move through that space. And then I'm going to, and this is kind of all in the same breath, so it's probably not so linear, but just to simplify it for this overview, it's also important that we anticipate barriers before learners have to bump into them, before learners have to suffer and feel anxiety, boredom, tension, frustration in order to get what they need. So how do we think about, even with our proactive design, are there barriers that still exist? And if there are, can we build more flexibility in? Can we design options for to remove those barriers? And that's where the UDL guidelines come in. The image on the left is a picture of like a bullseye target that's reminding us like, set that goal. And then those people that I described earlier, made out of geometric shapes of all different colors and sizes, they remind us like, design for learner variability, know about it, anticipate it. We know this. Then there's a picture of like a road construction sawhorse with some wood across with stripes to say like, don't drive here. That's to remind us to think about barriers ahead of time before learners have to find them and point them out to us. And then there's an image that looks like the UDL guidelines without all those words. And that's to remind us that we want to design options. We want to design more than one way for learners to do the activities of the learning. And I think that's the end. So thank you. All right, take care.